Now to look further at these latest developments, we have with us Dr. Jung-yeop, a research fellow at the Sejong Institute. It's good to have you back on the show.
My pleasure.
So President Moon spoke with Trump on the phone, and according to the Blue House readout, he emphasized South Korea's willingness for inter-Korean cooperation in order to encourage North Korea's denuclearization. He even talked about it as a way to lift the burden off the U.S. Now, how would it lift the burden from Trump?
So I think President Moon Jae-in is aiming to persuade President Trump in a way that, because we know that President Trump is very keen on the expense issues. So if somehow we can persuade President Trump that South Korea is going to take care of all the expenses, then it might be able to persuade President Trump that he might be easing the sanctions with negotiating with Kim Jong-un next week. So I think that's what President Moon was aiming for when he was talked over the phone with President Trump. But I don't know whether President Moon Jae-in explicitly asked for lifting sanctions, or President Moon emphasized that lifting sanctions could lead to the denuclearization of North Korea, because the readout to say that if this kind of economic aid can help the process of denuclearization, South Korea is willing to provide these and these. So I think it is following the principle that President Moon mentioned earlier, that we also following the sanctions until we have enough tangible products about North Korea's denuclearization. So I think that President Moon Jae-in is just sticking to the principle, but at the same time, he's giving the idea to the President Trump that economic project with North Korea might help its denuclearization.
You say perhaps he didn't specify about lifting of sanctions, but if President Moon, I mean, one of the things he talked about, he gave a specific example, reportedly, from the Blue House readout that says he talked about the inter-Korean project to reconnect the inter-Korean rail and road projects. Now, he'd have to have some sort of sanctions exemptions for that to go ahead. Would there not need to be?
So I think that shows some kind of the problems and obstacles that now we are facing in negotiating with North Korea. So Mr. Biegun, U.S. government's special representative to the North Korea policy, emphasized that the sanctions will remain intact, and President Trump said the same thing. And they are ready to provide some kind of political and diplomatic measures for the North Korea's initiatives on the denuclearization process. However, what North Korea wanted so far is lifting sanctions or easing the sanctions. So now, when President Moon mentioned these economic measures and hinted that these economic measures might help the denuclearization process of North Korea, that means that now it's the important question between two countries in negotiation next week. So now our government is emphasizing the element of economic side for the negotiation next week. However, U.S. government has been very firm on the sanctions. So I think our government is trying to persuade U.S. government that economic lifting the sanction is the key for the denuclearization negotiation next week, whereas it seems like that U.S. has been very firm on that issue.
The fact that the Blue House released so much information about President Trump's phone call with President Moon, do you think perhaps South Korea as a whole is showing this conversation and sending a message to Kim Jong-un as well as President Trump?
Sure. After the meetings that we all have, series of summits between two Koreas last year, and the meeting of President Kim and Kim Jong-un early January, that North Korea's media has reiterated every time that the economic project is very important, and even they are kind of saying that South Korea should not follow that obligation as a UN member state for the sanctions on North Korea. So North Korea basically wants South Korea to defy the sanction regimes. So South Korean government should show some kind of message to the North Korea that South Korean government is trying to give some kind of economic benefits to North Korea, but at the same time we have obligations to follow the UN sanctions. So since we are not free to provide any economic benefits to North Korea at this stage, by saying these kind of things to President Trump, we send a message to North Korea that we are trying our part.
President Moon has been pushing for inter-Korean exchanges ever since he came to office. How much does this next summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un hinge on President Moon's plans for the future as well?
So we have observed many cases that even very small things like visiting North Korea for the railroad survey or the survey for the forest issues, it's all about whether it's going to violate the sanctions imposed by the United Nations or the United States government. So I think that it's very important for South Korean government to go ahead with the economic project with North Korea if we have some kind of relief on the sanctions. Because of the international sanctions and the U.S. sanctions, there is not much room for South Korean government to go ahead with the economic project with North Korea. So I think that South Korean government has very high hope that the summit next week is going to produce some kind of tangible result that will also ultimately lead to some kind of sanctions relief by which the South Korean government can proceed economic project with North Korea.
Now that President Moon has perhaps suggested these ideas to President Trump, how actively do you think President Trump will push this card that President Moon has offered? I mean, do you not think Kim Jong-un would want the U.S. to offer their own incentives in the negotiations next week?
So now the U.S. government official position is that sanction is going to remain intact until the North Korea's full denuclearization. And it looks like the U.S. government is willing to provide some kind of political or diplomatic measures to correspond to North Korea's denuclearization measures. But it looks like that what North Korea wants at this stage is easing the sanctions or lifting sanctions. That means that President Trump, it all depends on the bilateral dialogue, bilateral dialogue between Trump and Kim, because at the working level, it doesn't look like that Mr. Biegun has a mandate to talk about the sanction issues at this stage. So I think that the only way that North Korea can get some kind of relief on the sanction is at the stage between Trump and Kim next week, between their direct talks. So I think that we have less process with the working level talks next week, and North Korea is going to put much higher bet on the President Trump's direct negotiation.
But Trump himself, he seems to be tempering expectations. I mean, he's saying that there's no rush. He sees no rush to see North Korea's denuclearization, and there is no pressing time schedule as long as North Korea does not conduct any more nuclear or missile tests. So what does this suggest for next week then?
So there are two elements with regard to these issues. The first, that who reports to President Trump these days? Right? Stephen Biegun just came back from Pyongyang and report the result to the President Trump. And apparently there is no real progress with his counterpart, the Ambassador Kim Yong-chul in Pyongyang. That would give some kind of negative impression to President Trump that he is not going to have a much more tangible result compared to the Singapore summit. And second, if President Trump is almost surrounded by negative views in Washington, especially from the Democrats' Congress House in the U.S. Congress, that it does not give much freedom for President Trump to give much sanctions relief to North Korea at this stage. So I think that is why President Trump shows much prudent much prudent image to the public that he's very slowly approaching this issue at this time.
And if I bring it back to the inter-Korean exchanges as well, I mean, if these talks, I mean, even if these talks, I think next week, the summit with President Trump and Kim Jong-un does not necessarily go great, we still expect some sort of progress towards their relations, do we not? And therefore, do you think that will give green light to more inter-Korean exchanges of some kind, at least anyway?
So I think it's not that realistic to expect a very high or much progress made at the summit next week. However, since we have experienced this kind of like blocked negotiation for past like 30 years, that any progress can be welcome at this stage, unless the product of the next week is not going to prohibit the further process of the denuclearization of North Korea. I think we should welcome any progress made by the summit next week.
And finally, Trump's point man on North Korea, Stephen Biegun, as you mentioned, he is supposed to arrive in Hanoi and then meet with Kim Jong-un, his North Korean counterpart, to finalize the details for this summit next week. I mean, but they've only got a week left, and there still seems to be a lot to do. I mean, what will they be able to do?
So they have to make the draft for the joint statement for the two leaders. However, I think so much part of the draft would be left blank, because within this like limited time frame, that I don't think that the two working level negotiators not be able to make much progress on the bigger issues. So they are going to work on some of the minor issues, such that the negotiation process about that lower level issues like liaison office and what can be exchanged for, or the repatriation issues, but much bigger deal will be left to the two leaders. So I think that draft will be left blank in much part.
Well, that's where we'll wrap things up for today. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.